All right, so I wanted to do this video for quite some time, and it's just finding the right way to put it into words. So here we go. I'm going to give this a red hot go. All right, so something that I have noticed from working with clients, and now look, I've been a stress and burnout coach for around 6 years or coming up to 6 years now. And prior to that, I had my own journey with burnout, and I spent a lot of time sort of understanding it and building up my knowledge around it. Now, I typically work with type A professionals, high performers, the high achievers of the world, right? I'm not saying that I only work with those people, but I typically seem to have those clients mainly. Now, there was definitely a theme that I have seen throughout this, and I haven't really seen other people talk about it, especially when we're looking at burnout. Now, when we look at burnout, especially if you look at the World Health Organization's description of it, which is emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion from prolonged stress that's happened in the workplace, or along those lines. That's not verbatim, but that's essentially what they say. But they really encapsulate that within the workplace, right? And something that I've noticed around, especially with the type A professionals, the high achievers, the high performers, is there's been some type of toxic situation that's happened in their childhood. I'm not saying this happens to everyone, but this has been something that I've noticed, and it's quite common. But something toxic has happened within their childhood, whether they've got a toxic parent, maybe something's happened at school, maybe they've got a narcissistic parent or something like that, right? And the thing is, when you've grown up in a toxic family or a toxic childhood, or something toxic or something bad has happened to you as a child, or something traumatic, or you've grown up with a narcissistic parent or two narcissistic parents, or all of the above, you create behaviors, right? And those behaviors can lead to adult burnout. And what I wanted to do today is talk about some of the behaviors that I've noticed within myself, and as well as within the clients that I've worked with as well, just to sort of get a better understanding around some of the behaviors that we can create in childhood because of toxic childhoods, because of traumatic childhoods, because of toxic parents, narcissistic parents, all of that kind of stuff can lead to burnout as an adult. Just a quick little disclaimer, I don't want to say that every single person that burns out, if they're a high achiever, has this kind of background, but it's definitely something that I've noticed. So one of the first behaviors that I see within my clients is hypervigilance, right? So here's the thing. If you've grown up in a toxic household, you've got a toxic parent, narcissistic parent, whatever it is, right? You end up becoming hypervigilant because at the end of the day, you don't know what to expect with your parents. So as a child, your parents are there to completely keep you safe, right? They're there to physically take care of you, emotionally nurture you, mentally develop you, hopefully, all of these things, right? Now, if you've got a toxic parent, a toxic, relationship happening in the household, narcissistic parent, it doesn't really create space for that. So what can end up happening is because you're so reliant on your parent to be taking care of you, you end up having to become really, really hyper aware of their emotions and their mood swings to make sure that you're constantly remaining safe. What that does is it creates a behavior that as you get into an adult, you still can become quite hypervigilant. So you can walk into a room and actually make sure that you can actually read other people's emotions, read other people's body language to make sure that you're consistently safe. And that's just something that I have noticed with a lot of my clients, is that they're very hypervigilant. They could literally walk into a room and they could actually tell you who's fighting with who they don't want to communicate with, who they feel safe with and who they don't, right? It's really granular with them, so they can really understand that. So that's definitely one behavior. Now, if you're constantly under hypervigilance, especially in the workplace, and you're constantly aware of your colleagues or your manager or whatever it is around you, it's going to be emotionally taxing on you because you don't really feel like you can ever relax because you're always looking for sort of those dangers, right? So that's something that's really important to understand. Now, the second behavior that I see from a lot of my clients, especially if they've grown up in, a toxic environment, is there's this element they don't know how to have boundaries. So a lot of the times, if you've grown up with a toxic parent or a narcissistic parent, it's going to be really hard to set boundaries because your parents are going to, those people, doesn't always have to be a parent, are going to constantly disrespect your boundaries. They're going to cross your boundaries. And it's going to be really difficult as a child to understand your own boundaries and reinforce them, where most people do learn boundaries as a child or a young adult. If you've grown up in a toxic environment, it's going to be really difficult. And that will follow you into adulthood. You won't understand what a realistic boundary is and how to reinforce it. Now, I've done a couple of videos around boundaries before, where when you think about a boundary, it's understanding where your emotions start, your behaviors and your actions start, and where they end, and where someone else's starts and ends. If you've grown up with a narcissistic parent or a toxic parent or been in a toxic environment, it's going to be really blurred, because a lot of the times, especially with narcissistic parents or toxic parents, it's really difficult to understand your emotions, because what will typically happen is they will make you responsible for their own emotions, and so it becomes really difficult for you to create boundaries and know what's normal and what's not normal. The third behavior that I frequently see is people pleasing. So if you've grown up in a toxic environment, you are constantly trying to keep safe, right? You want to make sure that everyone's happy around you so you don't get into trouble, so you remain physically safe at the end of the day. It also could be just keeping yourself emotionally safe and mentally safe, whatever it is, right? It's just an ability to keep safe. So you learn to just constantly be people pleasing, constantly understanding and expecting somebody else's needs before your own, and making sure that their needs are met before your own. Now, I'm sure people have heard about people pleasing before. However, this is kind of to the next level. So it's kind of making that guess of what someone wants and constantly making sure that they have what they need. And again, this is something that's just going to lead to you being exhausted, especially in the workplace, because you might end up taking on more work. You might want to say yes to things because you don't want to be disagreeable. You want to make sure that your job is safe. So therefore you want to say yes to everything because you're super scared of getting fired. All of those things, right? So people pleasing is definitely a behavior I have noticed, especially from people that have narcissistic parents. When they take that into the workplace, it's definitely going to be a recipe for burnout. Another behavior is sort of this emotional dysregulation that people can have, especially if you've grown up with a narcissistic parent or a toxic parent. What can be really challenging as a child, especially if you've grown up in that environment, is you don't really know what emotion's going to get you what at the end of the day. So you could be really, really happy, and that could make your parents really frustrated, or you could be really sad, and that's also going to make them frustrated. So what I find that a lot of people do, especially when they've grown up in these households, especially with these high performers, is they have this emotional they have a really short or small emotional range. Is they don't really feel happy because they don't trust it, and they don't really want to feel sad because they don't want to sort of dig deep into that, because it's also never really been rewarded, or it's never been positively reinforced to have a bad emotion or a good emotion. So they kind of have this sort of like numbed out sort of emotional range, which essentially doesn't allow them to feel all emotions. But here's the other thing. I'm not saying that they're a sociopath or anything like that. What they're doing is they're constantly keeping their emotions in check, which is absolutely exhausting, because they don't want to be too excited for not trusting it, and they don't want to be too sad because they don't want to bring anyone else down. They just want to be sort of within a normal range. And this is just exhausting. If you're constantly having to measure and manage your emotions on a day-to-day basis to make sure that you don't get too excited or too happy, or you don't get too sad, it's exhausting. And if you take that behavior into the workplace, people kind of might find you being quite unemotional. They might think that you are like completely fine with everything, when you're really not. You're just really just trying to keep everything together. So that's definitely something that I've also seen, and it's really, really exhausting for people over the long term as well. The other thing that I have noticed is that the relationship with their work is really unhealthy. So a lot of people that have grown up in narcissistic relationships or have toxic parents, and they are high achievers or overachievers, is their ability to work really long hours. Now, it's really interesting, because if you've grown up with a narcissistic parent or you've got a toxic parent, you've probably not been positively reinforced consistently. So a lot of the times when people have grown up with toxic parents or toxic or narcissistic parents or had a toxic environment, they're sort of what I call circumstantial love. So you don't really know when you're going to get a positive reinforcement. Like, you could get an A at school one day, and you could come home and your parent might be like, well done. The next day it could be like, well, that was just your job. The next day it could just be completely ignored. So you have no idea what behavior is going to get any type of reaction. So what ends up happening is it's really difficult to sort of understand that positive reinforcement. The other thing is as well, a lot of narcissistic parents and toxic parents don't always give that positive reinforcement. So what happens when these people enter the workforce is that they will start working hard, and they'll get that positive reinforcement, which will then drive them to work more. and consistently because they have no boundaries, right? And they're constantly looking for that positive reinforcement, which they've never gotten. The other thing is as well, it kind of ties to their self-esteem as well and their self-worth. So if they're doing really well at work, they're going to feel, actually, finally, I'm getting some positive reinforcement. I'm also in control of this. I'm also getting that recognition that I never really got. And it can drive that overworking kind of mentality and that kind of culture as well. And it also is that tied to that self-esteem and that self-worth as well, which is really, really dangerous for all these people, because what can end up happening is you can only work so many hours. And if you constantly keep trying to, get to the next level and keep changing the goalposts, it's going to create this behavior of burning out. And that's something that I've also seen a lot with my clients, is they don't know how to regulate that sort of success, that self-worth, that overworking, that positive reinforcement kind of element. And again, it kind of comes back down to a control thing, right? They can control that kind of reaction. They can kind of control their future, whereas they couldn't when they were kids. Another behavior that I typically see is the inability to sort of embrace good things. And so what I mean by that is, let's say things are going really well. Maybe they've been given a promotion at work. Maybe they've finally been getting that recognition. They're getting the rewards, the accolades from working really, really hard. The dilemma is when you've grown up in a toxic environment, you can't trust that. So what they're doing is they're constantly looking for the other shoe to drop. And again, this can come down to that sort of an anxiety thing here as well. But I do see it a lot with my high performers and my high achievers. They'll come to me going like, I'm really happy, but I'm so scared of being happy because I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop, which again is constantly being on guard, and it's really draining and it's really, really exhausting. So for these people, it's really important to help them understand that there is different ways to view things, and there's definitely different ways to sort of break those habits and those behaviors as well. It just takes time. A lot of the times, if you've grown up in a toxic family, you've got a toxic parent, you've got a narcissistic parent, it takes time to undo the things that you've learned as a kid. And those things can still come back, right? But you have to consistently be able to self-coach yourself out of those. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time doing with a lot of my clients as well. And it's something I think is so important, especially when we're having this conversation around burnout, right? It's so easy to say it's just, oh, you're overworking. Oh, you're putting too much effort in. Oh, you've got a bad manager. Oh, you've got a toxic workplace. Sometimes it's not that, right? Sometimes it's genuinely the behaviors that we've created simply from situations that were completely out of our control, and we're taking those behaviors into a workplace, and it's consistently running our lives, right? Now, look, there's just a couple of different behaviors that I've seen. I've definitely got other ones as well, but to make sure that this video doesn't go on forever, I think that's a really good starting point. Now, if any of these have sort of hit you, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you. If you want to know a little bit more information, I do talk quite a lot about this in my membership, so the Get Your Shit Together membership. So definitely check that out. If you want to just have a private one-on-one with me, please just head over to my LinkedIn, send me a DM. I'm more than happy to sort of schedule in a one-on-one call as well.